September 29, 1941. Kiev. Babi Yar Ravine. 7 a.m. The morning breaks cold over the occupied Soviet city. Frost clings to the streets of Kiev, to the stone buildings, to the hands of those ordered to assemble. Thousands move through the pre-dawn darkness, families bundled in winter coats, carrying documents, suitcases, the weight of a lie they do not yet comprehend. The notices posted 3 days earlier promised resettlement, promised safety, promised that if they brought their valuables, their warm clothing, their identification papers, they would be transported elsewhere. They believed it. Many of them desperately wanted to believe it. Across the ravine's northern edge, in a land carved by centuries of erosion and geography, soldiers and SS officers wait in silence. Not for resettlement. For execution. This is the story of Paul Blobel, an architect, an unemployed craftsman, a man broken by economic collapse and then rebuilt by ideological hatred. A Nazi commander whose name became synonymous with industrial-scale murder, and whose fate would eventually demand reckoning in a Nuremberg courtroom. But more than that, it is the story of a single event, the Babi Yar massacre, that would become one of the largest mass murders at a single location during the entire Second World War. The architecture of dissent, a man before the killing. To understand Paul Wilhelm Hermann Blobel, we must first understand the soil from which his cruelty grew. On August 13, 1894, in the Prussian city of Potsdam, Wilhelm and Anna Blobel welcomed their first son into a world of timber-framed houses and modest labor. The Blobel family was skilled in the trades: bricklayers, carpenters, builders. Young Paul inherited this legacy. During the First World War, he volunteered for the German army, served in the Pioneer Regiment until 1918, and returned home as millions did, fractured, dispossessed, searching for purpose in a nation torn to pieces by defeat. In the years that followed, Blobel learned architecture, the design of structures and spaces. In 1924, he established himself as an independent architect in Remscheid, a coal and steel region of western Germany where the smoke never quite lifted from the horizon. For several years, his work was steady. Then came the autumn of 1929. The stock market crashed across the Atlantic, and the economic shock waves reverberated through every German city, every German street, every German home. Orders for new buildings dried up almost overnight. By 1930, Blobel found himself unemployed, living off meager government benefits, watching his skills become worthless in a nation that no longer believed in building anything but despair. The Great Depression gripped Germany with particular ferocity. National unemployment reached catastrophic levels. Bank failures cascaded like dominoes. Breadlines stretched around city blocks. Businesses collapsed. The German state itself seemed to be crumbling into dust. In a climate of such profound desperation, the promise of radical change became intoxicating. On December 1, 1931, when Blobel was 37 years old, jobless, and watching his professional identity dissolve, he joined the National Socialist Party. Membership number 844662. Within weeks, in January 1932, he joined the SS. The organization offered structure, purpose, and belonging, commodities more precious than any paycheck in an age of economic annihilation. By 1935, his party contacts had secured him a position in the SD, the security service of the Nazi regime. His work involved intelligence gathering and administration in Dusseldorf. Blobel was not an ideologue of the fanatical sort. By all accounts, he was a bureaucrat, a functionary, a man seeking employment and security through organizational affiliation. Yet this very ordinariness was perhaps his greatest sin. He had learned a lesson during his years of unemployment: loyalty to the system that employed him was the highest good. When the system demanded participation in atrocity, Blobel would prove exceptionally efficient. The Machinery of Death, June 1941 to September 1941. In May 1941, Blobel received orders to report to the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin. The conversation was brief and purposeful. He was appointed commander of Sonderkommando 4A, a special unit of Einsatzgruppe C. In June 1941, he traveled to Pretzken, Saxony, a training facility where the commanders of the mobile killing units assembled for their final briefing before Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen were death squads. Between June and October 1941 alone, approximately 51,000 people, Jews, Roma, Soviet political commissars, and supposed enemies of the state, would be murdered under Blobel's command in the territories behind the German advance. The killing was not incidental to the invasion. It was systematized, documented, and deliberate. Einsatzgruppe was assigned to the area of Army Group South, under the overall command of Field Marshal Walther von Reichenau, a general as committed to genocide as any SS officer. From June 27 to June 29, 1941, Blobel's unit massacred 300 Jews and 317 communists in the region of Sokol and Luck. A few weeks later, approximately 2,531 people were killed near Zhytomyr. In Fastov, southwest of Kiev, Blobel's men executed all Jews between the ages of 12 and 60. With each massacre, the killing became more efficient. The horror was administratively perfected. Blobel was learning his craft with alarming rapidity. September 29, 1941, the Ravine fills. By late September 1941, German forces had occupied Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. The city was incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ukraine on September 1, 1941, administered by Nazi Party official Erich Koch. In the first days of occupation, German military buildings were bombed, attacks the Germans blamed on the Jewish population, though the NKVD, Soviet secret police, was almost certainly responsible. The bombing provided the pretext for what had already been decided: the systematic murder of Kiev's entire Jewish population. On September 28, 1941, printed notices appeared on street corners, on lampposts, on synagogue doors. Written in Russian, German, and Ukrainian, the notices read: On Monday, September 29, you are to appear by 7 a.m. with your possessions, money, documents, valuables and warm clothing at Dorogozhetsaya Street, next to the Jewish cemetery. Failure to appear is punishable by death. The deception was complete. The notices promised resettlement, promised relocation, promised safety if only the Jews would present themselves with their documents and valuables intact. Families discussed it quietly that night. Some were skeptical. Many desperately hoped the notice was genuine, that this meant the threat had passed, that they might be moved to a labor camp rather than murdered outright. Parents told their children to bring warm clothing. The elderly packed photographs. A family's inheritance, a watch, a ring, a piece of jewelry, was wrapped carefully and placed in a pocket. Approximately 33,771 men, women, and children, the overwhelming majority of Kiev's remaining Jewish population, marched toward Babi Yar on the morning of September 29. Behind them, police and SS units followed. The victims proceeded along Melnik Street, past the old Jewish cemetery, and toward the ravine's edge. Armed guards directed them forward. SS officers, members of Sonderkommando 4A, members of the Order Police battalions, Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, and Wehrmacht soldiers waited in organized formations. As the condemned reached the ravine, they were ordered to undress. All of it: coats, shoes, jewelry, everything of value. They were separated into small groups. Some of those waiting, prisoners, workers, those forced to observe the machinery of death, reported what would occur in the next hours. The victims were herded to the edge of the ravine and shot in groups of perhaps 20 at a time. Bodies tumbled into the gully below. New groups were brought forward. The shooting continued through that day and into the night. It resumed at dawn on September 30th. For 48 hours, the ravine filled with the dead, 33,771 of them, stacked in the darkness, a geometry of corpses. Among the few survivors was a woman named Dina Pronikiva, a Jewish actress who had hidden in the city before the massacre. Trapped within the crowd, forced to the ravine's edge, she would testify years later about the screaming, the sound of automatic weapons fire, the mothers torn away from their children. She managed to jump into the ravine as the shooting erupted, landed among corpses, covered herself with dirt and the bodies of the dead, and played dead through the night while the killing continued. A German officer shone a torch on her face, saw what he took for a lifeless countenance, and moved on. She emerged from that ravine, one of fewer than 30 known survivors. Blobel, standing at the ravine's edge, observing the operation he had organized, reported back to Berlin that 33,771 Jews had been executed. The task had consumed approximately 2 days of coordinated shooting. It was one of the largest massacres of the entire war. In the formal communications sent back to the Einsatzgruppen headquarters, the event was recorded, documented, filed away like a construction project completed on schedule. At his post-war trial, Blobel would dispute the number. He would claim that no more than half the reported figure, roughly 15,000 to 17,000, had actually been shot. The claim was ludicrous in the face of the evidence. Yet the dispute itself illuminates something true about the Nazi bureaucracy. The perpetrators often sought to minimize the scale of their crimes not out of moral recognition but out of the calculus of culpability. Fewer victims meant less personal responsibility. The machinery turns inward, Action 1005. By January 1942, Blobel had been removed from direct command of Sonderkommando 4A, ostensibly due to health complications brought on by alcoholism. The stress of mass murder, it appeared, affected even those tasked with performing it. Yet the Nazi regime could not afford to discard a man who had proven so organizationally competent. Instead, in June 1942, Blobel received a new assignment. He was called to Berlin and given a task so secret that not a single written order would document it. The instructions were conveyed verbally only, by Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo. The task was called Action 1005 or Special Action 1005. By the summer of 1942, it had become clear to the Nazi leadership that the Allies would eventually defeat Germany and investigate its crimes. The physical evidence of genocide had to be erased. Mass graves across occupied Europe would need to be exhumed, the bodies burned, the ashes scattered, and any trace of the systematic murder obliterated from the landscape. Blobel was tasked with leading this operation. He traveled to the camps and massacre sites with the cover title of Deputy of Heinrich Müller and the actual mission to develop efficient methods for eliminating evidence of Nazi mass murder. He began his experimentation at Chelmno, the first extermination camp, where mobile gas vans had killed thousands of Jews. The initial attempts at body disposal involved incendiary bombs, an approach that proved counterproductive when the exploding ordnance set nearby forests on fire. Blobel then adapted his thinking to the specific problem. In the summer of 1942, he developed what would become his method for mass cremation. He constructed enormous pyres out of long wooden beams, arranged alternating layers of bodies with firewood between them, and set the entire structure ablaze. The technique was remarkably efficient. Bodies burned away to ash and bone fragment. When the fire cooled, specialized machinery pulverized the remaining bone, reducing the remains to powder nearly indistinguishable from ash. The crushed remains were reburied in the same mass graves from which they had come, or scattered across farmland, or blown into the wind. The graves were then filled in, the earth tamped down, and crops replanted. In August 1943, Blobel personally traveled to Kiev and observed the cremation of the mass grave at Babi Yar. The grave was approximately 55 meters long, 3 meters wide, and 2.5 meters deep. After excavation and the application of flammable material, the bodies burned for approximately 2 days until the grave had burned down to the bottom. Blobel took careful notes. He would implement the same technique at Babi Yar as he refined the process elsewhere across the occupied territories. Between the summers of 1942 and 1943, the remains of hundreds of thousands were cremated at Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other death camps and massacre sites across Nazi-occupied Europe. Jewish prisoners and Soviet prisoners of war were forced to perform the labor. When the exhumation and cremation was complete at each location, the prisoners themselves were executed. Their knowledge made them dangerous to the regime's future defense. Blobel estimated that by the time the operation concluded in 1944, the evidence of nearly the entire apparatus of industrialized genocide had been physically destroyed. The Reckoning, Nuremberg 1947. The war ended in May 1945. Germany was divided among the victorious Allied powers. The first major war crimes trial began in Nuremberg in November 1945, prosecuting the highest Nazi leadership, the generals, the ministers, the ideologues who had conceived and orchestrated the machinery of genocide. In September 1947, a second tribunal opened in the same courtroom. This was the Einsatzgruppen trial, prosecution of the men who had actually executed the plan. 24 defendants stood in the dock. Paul Blobel was among them. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. Documents were read aloud. Situation reports from 1941, filed by Blobel's own command, were entered into evidence. Survivor testimony was heard. Blobel stood accused of responsibility for the murder of approximately 60,000 people between June 1941 and January 1942. The charge included the Babi Yar massacre, the largest single operation conducted under his command. Blobel's defense was the standard refuge of Nazi functionaries: obedience to superior orders. He claimed he had been acting under orders issued by higher authority Friedrich Jekyll, the higher SS and police leader, and ultimately by Adolf Hitler himself. He claimed that the decision to kill the Jews of Kiev had been made by the German military governor, the police commander, and the Einsatzgruppe leadership, not by him. He was merely the executor of decisions made above him. The tribunal found this argument unconvincing. The tribunal's verdict noted the particular problem of Blobel's testimony. At Kiev, 33,771 Jews had been murdered in 48 hours. The scale was so enormous that it contradicted any narrative of careful investigation and individual review. The verdict stated, "It is enough to refer to the massacre at Kiev where 33,771 Jews were executed in 2 days immediately after an alleged incendiary fire, to disprove Blobel's utterance in this regard." Blobel attempted another line of defense. He claimed that the killings at Babi Yar were legally justified under the Hague Convention, international law governing warfare. Executions of agents, partisans, saboteurs, suspicious people, indulging in espionage and sabotage, and those who were of a detrimental effect to the German army, were, in my opinion, completely in accordance with the Hague Convention, he testified. The claim was absurd. The victims at Babi Yar were predominantly women, children, and the elderly, people incapable of military threat. The massacre was not a military operation but an act of genocide. The Hague Convention said nothing to justify the systematic murder of an entire people. Blobel was convicted on all charges. On April 10, 1948, the tribunal found him guilty under all counts of the indictment and sentenced him to death by hanging. The final moment. For 3 years, Blobel remained imprisoned at Landsberg prison, waiting for his execution. The appeals process wound through the post-war legal machinery. On June 7, 1951, in the courtyard of Landsberg prison, the sentence was carried out. Blobel was led to the gallows. A hood was drawn over his head. The noose was fitted around his neck. And then he was hanged. The architect of Babi Yar finally subject to justice, though no legal punishment could ever approach the magnitude of the crime. His final words were reported to be, "Whatever I have done, I did as a soldier who obeyed orders." But this was false. Blobel had not been a soldier. He had been a civilian architect who joined the Nazi Party during economic desperation, who rose through the ranks of the SS and SD, who took command of a killing unit, and who organized systematic mass murder with an efficiency born of bureaucratic competence. He had not simply followed orders. He had designed systems, refined techniques, and sought promotion through demonstrated competence in genocide. The Ravine's testimony, what remained? Babi Yar itself survived the Nazis' attempt to erase it from history. The ravine remained. The earth that held the ashes remained. The survivors who emerged from the grave, fewer than 30 of them, carried their testimony into the post-war world. Dina Pranikiva lived for decades after the war, speaking publicly about what she had witnessed, what she had endured. In the 1960s, the Soviet poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko visited Babi Yar with Anatoly Kuznetsov, another eyewitness to the massacre. Yevtushenko wrote a poem reflecting on the site. The poem would later inspire composer Dmitri Shostakovich to write his 13th Symphony, a work of profound sorrow and moral reckoning. The physical evidence that Paul Blobel had attempted to erase, not through successful cremation but through systematic destruction of the grave itself, became instead a memorial. A monument was erected at Babi Yar. And the names of the murdered, the 33,771 men, women, and children shot in that ravine across September 29 and 30, 1941, became the historical record that Blobel's regime tried so desperately to suppress. Reflection: the ordinary monster. The tragedy of the Babi Yar massacre, and the tragedy of Paul Blobel's role in it, rests upon a profound historical truth: atrocities of this scale are not perpetrated by demons or madmen alone. They are perpetrated by ordinary men elevated by circumstance and ideology into positions of administrative power over life and death. Blobel was an unemployed architect rendered desperate by economic collapse. The Nazi regime offered him employment, purpose, and belonging during an era when these were precious commodities. In exchange, it demanded his participation in genocide. This is not an excuse for Blobel's crimes. It is an explanation for how they became possible. Millions of people face economic desperation without becoming architects of atrocity. Millions of people join organizations without participating in mass murder. Yet some men like Paul Blobel, found in the Nazi regime a structure that permitted them to transform their personal desperation into historical catastrophe. The Einsatzgruppen were responsible for approximately 2 million murders during the war, roughly one-third of all Holocaust victims. They operated for 4 years across occupied Eastern Europe, often in small units, with minimal direct supervision from the highest Nazi leadership. They succeeded in creating an apparatus of genocide because ordinary men like Blobel demonstrated exceptional competence in the systematic performance of murder. Blobel's death in 1951 did not undo the massacre at Babi Yar. No execution, no legal proceeding, no amount of historical reckoning could restore the lives of the 33,771 people who were murdered in that ravine, or the hundreds of thousands more murdered under Blobel's command. Yet his trial, conviction, and execution established a crucial precedent, that perpetrators of genocide would not escape accountability simply by claiming obedience to superior orders. That those who designed systems of mass murder would not be permitted to hide behind bureaucratic anonymity. The ravine at Kiev remains. Generations of Ukrainians have walked past it, understanding that beneath the earth lies one of the war's greatest atrocities. And the world, for nearly 80 years now, has studied the story of Paul Blobel, the architect who built monuments of death, as a reminder of what human beings are capable of, and as a warning of what must be vigilantly opposed in perpetuity.